Today's lab is on plate tectonics. Plate tectonics, like a lot of things in geology, is something that people are exposed to in really different amounts in high school. You might never mention it in high school. You might become very familiar with it. Um, Plate tectonics is one of the great unifying theories of geological sciences. And what's interesting is that it really has only been known about since about 1960. So there have been very recently faculty members who weren't like brought up, whose undergraduate education didn't include anything about plate tectonics because it just wasn't part of the field yet. Several centuries since the age of exploration, when people have had access to maps of both Africa and South America, some people have noted that it looks like the coast of South America sort of fits into the coast of Africa. If you're like basing this on 16th century science, it doesn't really make any sense. You don't have any real understanding of why that might have happened. And it was only in the early 20th century that Alfred Wegener started popularizing the idea of continental drift. He still didn't have a real mechanism for it. In the 1950s, um, scientists were interested in being able to track where nuclear bomb tests were. And so there started being global monitoring of seismicity, which started revealing some of what would in the future be understood to be plate tectonic boundaries. However, it was only in the 50s and 60s when the ocean floor started getting mapped, and they understood that there were like mountain ranges, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, for example, where new oceanic crust is being created, that the idea of seafloor spreading then provided a mechanism for continental drift and helped found plate tectonic theory. This mapping of the ocean floor, and particularly of the mid-Atlantic ridges, was done by Marie Tharp and Bruce Heezen. I've pictured Marie Tharp and not Bruce Heezen because Bruce Heezen published their joint work under only his name due to the sexism of mid-20th century geosciences, and also because Bruce Heezen believed that the world was like expanding due to mid-ocean ridges, whereas Marie Tharp's interpretations, I believe, have withstood better the test of time. The Earth has many layers. It's differentiated by density. The very center of the Earth is solid, mostly iron and nickel. The outer core is liquid, and then the mantle takes up the majority of the Earth. The crust, relative to the size of the Earth, is actually thinner than an eggshell. The crust and the very uppermost mantle comprise what's called the lithosphere. This comes from the Greek word for rock, and it's what moves around in plate tectonics. The asthenosphere, in contrast, is the more liquid part, the more ductile part of the mantle below the lithosphere. And plate tectonics is ultimately driven by convection in the mantle. The crust, the topmost layer, is brittle. It can break. It's divided into oceanic and continental crust, which will be on the next slides. It's about 1075 kilometers thick. In contrast, the mantle is slow and ductile. It flows slowly. It goes down to almost 3,000 kilometers, and it's ultramafic in its composition. Oceanic crust is thinner, it's denser, it's more mafic, its composition is more basaltic. Continental crust is thicker, it's less dense, it's higher in silica, it's more granitic in its composition. To look again at the difference between the lithosphere and the asthenosphere, here's a cross-section of the Earth again. So the lithosphere is brittle, it breaks. It's 200 to 300 kilometers thick, and it's the crust in the upper mantle. It's differentiated from the asthenosphere based on mechanical properties. The asthenosphere is ductile, it flows slowly. It's in the lower mantle, and it has convection cells, which ultimately drive plate tectonics. The crust and mantle both are differentiated from the core, both the liquid outer part of it and the solid inner part of it, which are primarily comprised of iron and nickel. You can see here the different plate tectonic boundaries. A lot of these are very similar to the boundaries of continents that we're used to seeing. However, there are some tectonic boundaries that take place just in the ocean. You can also see this line in the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of it. This is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and there's seafloor spreading in this region. Plate tectonic boundaries have changed over time. You've probably heard of Pangaea, which ended up breaking into Laurasia and Gondwanaland in the Triassic, the beginning of the time of the dinosaurs. Throughout the Mesozoic, so the time of the dinosaurs, Pangaea broke apart when we ended up with the plates in their present day location. There have actually been supercontinents before Pangaea. There was one called Rodinia. Like the plates have moved a lot over time throughout the Earth's history. We can tell part of where to expect to find plate boundaries based on seismicity, so where you find earthquakes. These have been mapped since the middle of the Cold War, when people were interested in knowing where nuclear bomb tests were. There are three main types of plate boundaries. We're going to break convergent boundaries into two different types, so sometimes you'll see four divisions in this class. Divergent boundaries are where plates are moving apart. Also, this slide is good for the questions in the lab when you're being asked, like, what way should your arrows be pointing? And the divergent boundary, the plates are moving apart from each other, so it makes sense to have the arrows moving away from each other. Divergent boundaries are regions of spreading. This can occur in the ocean with mid-ocean ridges. It can also happen in continents, and then a new area, probably with ocean, will form. So like the Rift Valley in Africa. Currently it's continental. Eventually it's likely that a sea will open up there, unless the divergence stops. Convergent boundaries are where two plates come together. If one of these is an oceanic plate, it's likely that one plate will just go under the other. If these are both continental plates, it's likely that you will see major mountain building in this location, somewhere like the Himalaya today, where the Indian and Eurasian plates are coming together. So convergent boundaries can be broken into subduction, one plate going under the other, or continental collision, which is associated with mountain building. Transform boundaries, such as the San Andreas Fault, are places where two plates are moving past each other. They aren't moving into each other or away from each other, but they are moving along the same line as each other. Okay, so I want you to look at this figure and look at the different plate boundaries and think about what types of boundaries these are. Take a minute, maybe pause the video, and then on the next slide, we'll go over it. From left to right, we have two plates coming together first. We have one plate sinking under the other one. These are both oceanic plates, it looks like. So this is a convergent boundary, and specifically it is subduction. Subduction is often associated with stratovolcanoes, so it makes sense that you see one here. Then you have a transform boundary. Two plates are moving past each other. Next, you have a region of divergence. Two plates are moving away from each other, and new crust is being formed. Then you have another subduction region. One plate is being subducted. The oceanic plate is moving under the continental plate. Finally, on the right, you have another region of divergence. This is a place of rifting. A new crust is being formed. Eventually, there will be like a C in this region if divergence continues. Subduction is one of the types of convergent boundaries, and it involves an oceanic plate. It could possibly involve two oceanic plates also. In that case, the denser one will go underneath the less dense one. So the dense oceanic plate subducts or dives beneath less dense material, usually a continental plate. This ends up with mountain building and creates stratovolcanoes, which are the big conical ones, and it also it involves very deep earthquakes. Continental collision is the other type of convergent boundary. So here you have two continents crashing into each other. Two less dense continental plates collide and you build a mountain range. An example of that is the Himalaya, which today are being built between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. Oceanic collision is very similar. Subduction, one plate will move under the other, and you will form an arc of volcanoes. Continental rifting is a type of divergent boundary. In this type of plate boundary, a continent will be ripping itself apart, and it's a young plate boundary inside the continental crust. Eventually, this will become new oceanic crust. New crust that comes up is going to be made of very heavy mafic mantle material, and so it will behave as oceanic crust. And that area will be less dense, and water will eventually form it if the rifting continues. This will happen if rifting continues in Africa's Rift Valley. Seafloor spreading is another type of divergent boundary. Convection in the mantle causes upwelling and creation of a new area of oceanic crust and a mid-ocean ridge, for example, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. You can tell where seafloor spreading is occurring if you look at the age of the lithosphere in the ocean. So oceanic crust is heavier and it gets recycled back into the mantle more easily than continental crust does. And so the oldest parts of the Earth's ocean crust are only 200 or so million years old, whereas the oldest continental crust is up to 4 billion years old. You can see at these areas of spreading, the crust is the youngest, so right around the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And then as you near the coasts, you find the older crust. So you can tell where rifting has occurred by looking at these areas of young oceanic crust. Strike slip or transform faults are when two plates slide horizontally past each other. You don't find mountains here, you don't find volcanoes here. However, there are lots of shallow earthquakes. So in the lab, you're going to basically be looking for the places that you know are plate boundaries, but that you haven't already identified as either convergent or divergent boundaries. These areas don't have stratovolcanoes or very young crust associated with them. One example is the San Andreas Fault in Wallace Creek. Just to review, these areas, convergent plate boundaries, transform plate boundaries, and divergent plate boundaries, they're probably not in practice going to occur very close to each other, as this picture would suggest. But this helps you visualize the different ones of them. And then here's a map again of global seismicity in a 30-day period. That we can track convection in the mantle and see how plates have moved over time is through mantle plumes and hot spots. So these are areas with convection in the mantle, just straight up hot mantle material coming up towards the Earth's crust. And so, for example, the island arc that has formed Hawaii was caused by a hotspot. So this means that the crust has moved over the same like mantle plume, and over time, you can see over like 4 or 5 million years, this has moved quite a ways. And so you formed these different islands from different times when material from the mantle has come upwards, and it's all from the same spot. It's the Earth's crust that's moving. You'll notice that most, but not all, global seismicity in this 30-day period occurred along plate boundaries. For example, there was notable seismicity around Oklahoma. Now, it's possible that not all of this seismicity in Oklahoma was due to hydraulic fracturing, but it's likely that that was associated with at least some of it. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking involves drilling a long steel pipe called a wellbore into the earth until it hits the ground layer, which has oil or natural gas. This wellbore then extends horizontally, and fracking fluid, which contains water, salt, sand, and additives, is pumped through the pipe at high pressure. This is so that it can crack the underground rocks and release natural gas and oil. Some hazardous wastewater then returns to the surface, and speculators inject it back into the ground in deep disposal wells. Both the fracking itself and the disposal of wastewater have been linked to earthquakes. Canadian researchers have primarily found earthquakes related to fracking itself, whereas in the US, wastewater disposal has typically been thought to be the main culprit. These earthquakes are especially prone to happen in places where ancient fault lines, places that aren't necessarily tectonically active today, but might have been billions of years ago, are present. Now, when you're answering question 15, I understand that fracking is a very complicated issue, and you are very likely to have an opinion that has factors other than induced seismicity informing it. For example, because most renewable energy sources don't have constant availability, but it's hard to turn coal power plants on and off, the availability of natural gas facilitates that transition from coal to renewables. On the other hand, you've probably heard of myriad environmental issues, from water contamination to soil contamination to methane leaking, as well as air pollution and climate change, all related to fracking. So I'm not expecting you to have one particular opinion or another about fracking, and I definitely understand that your opinion might be based in factors other than just induced seismicity, but I would like you to really thoughtfully try to engage with question 15 and write at least a paragraph for that. A seismic gap is a segment of an active fault known to produce significant earthquakes that has not slipped in an unusually long time compared with other segments along the same structure. So, for example, along the west coast of South America, around Chile, there was a region that hadn't had any significant earthquakes since 1900, whereas almost all of the rest of the coastline had been affected by significant earthquakes. In 2014, this earthquake near the city of Iquique had a 7.7 earthquake. This can be caused, basically, you imagine the faults are sliding past each other, and then in one area, they're sort of stuck. And so when they get unstuck, that earthquake might be much stronger than something that it would have experienced if there were like smaller earthquakes occurring more regularly. So just to summarize some of these major types of plate tectonic boundaries, in subduction zones, these are convergent boundaries, plates move towards each other. There's at least one oceanic plate, and one will go under the other. In continental collision, the other type of convergent boundary, you have two continental plates, the plates move towards each other, and you form very high mountain ranges, such as the Himalaya. In mid-ocean ridges, such as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, two oceanic plates move away from each other, and new oceanic crust is formed. In transform boundaries. Plates move parallel to the boundary, but in opposite directions. Both plates can either be oceanic or continental, and an example is the San Andreas Fault. In this lab, you're going to be looking at the world using maps of seismicity, ocean floor age, etc., in order to figure out where the different plate boundaries are and what types of boundaries these are. Please actively do questions 6 through 8, and you do need to explain how you assign the arrow directions. This is actually like pretty straightforward. The question can be a little bit confusing, but it's just like, are the arrows pointing towards each other? If so, why? Is it because the continents are moving towards each other? Are you drawing arrows pointing away from each other because the continents are moving away from each other? Anyway, please contact me if you have any questions. This is a pretty long lab. I'm not asking you to do questions L9 or L11 or the imperial system parts of L10. So that's C and D. You still need to do 10A, B, and E. I'm assigning questions 12 and 13 as extra credit. These I didn't cover in the lecture, but you can read page 35 to answer them. Please do the reading on page 36 before answering question 14. Please do the reading on pages 37 and 38 before answering question 15. Please answer question 15 thoughtfully. Answer it in at least a paragraph. Think about it. You don't have to write a page or anything, but please do write it in several well-formed sentences. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions and have a good week.